My grandmother left me nothing but an old cottage in the Scottish Highlands while my sister inherited the family's prosperity in Edinburgh. My husband called me foolish for accepting such a burden, and when I refused to sell it immediately, he filed for divorce. But that crumbling stone house would become the key to unlocking a heritage I never knew existed, changing everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world. If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. Hello, my name is Maya Sinclair, and I'm 75 years old. I work as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Edinburgh, Scotland. If I had to describe my life before that fateful inheritance, I'd say it was like a perfectly organized spreadsheet, everything in its proper column, balanced to the penny, but somehow lacking the vibrancy that makes numbers dance with meaning. I grew up in Edinburgh's new town with my parents Robert and Catherine Sinclair, respectable middle-class professionals. My sister Fiona, 3 years younger, was everything I wasn't: confident, ambitious, and naturally suited to the life our parents had mapped out for us. While she became a successful barrister and married well, I found contentment in my quiet accounting job and married David Cameron, a reliable business manager who appreciated my steadiness. Our marriage was conventional but increasingly strained. David constantly pushed me to aim higher, earn more, climb the corporate ladder. "You're wasting your talents at that little firm," he'd say. "Don't you want more from life?" I didn't know how to explain that I was content, that success meant something different to me than it did to him. My parents rarely spoke about our family's deeper history. I knew fragments, that my grandmother Isla lived apart from the family in the Highlands, that there had been some falling out generations ago. Sometimes I wondered about the red highlights in my brown hair that caught fire in sunlight, or why my eyes were such an unusual shade of green, so different from my blonde, blue-eyed family. Everything changed on a gray February morning when the call came from the hospital. My grandmother Isla had died peacefully in her sleep at 89. At the funeral in Pitlochry, I was struck by how many people attended, how warmly they spoke of her, how little I knew about this woman who shared my blood. The solicitor's reading of the will shocked everyone. Fiona inherited grandmother Isla's modest savings and valuable book collection. I inherited Thistlewood Cottage in Glenmorvan, a place I'd never heard of, along with all artifacts, documents, and materials related to the preservation of Highland cultural traditions. David's reaction was immediate. "How much is it worth?" "We don't need a cottage in some godforsaken glen. Sell it and let's put the money toward a proper house in Edinburgh." But something in me resisted. When the solicitor handed me 2 heavy iron keys worn smooth by decades of handling, along with a note in my grandmother's script that read, "For Maya, who will understand when she's ready," I felt compelled to see what she'd left me before making any decisions. I drove to Glenmorvan on a March Saturday, leaving David with his newspapers and disapproval. The journey took me through increasingly wild landscapes that seemed to awaken something inside me I'd never known was sleeping. Glenmorvan was a hidden valley accessible only by a narrow road that wound between towering hills covered in heather and ancient pines. Thistlewood Cottage stood at the end of the glen, smaller than I'd expected, built of gray Highland stone with a slate roof green with moss. It looked as though it had grown from the land itself, natural and permanent as the hills surrounding it. Though clearly needing attention, with sagging gutters and weathered wood, something about the place called to me like a half-remembered song. The larger key opened the front door easily. Inside, everything was covered in dust sheets, but sunlight through deep-set windows revealed wide plank floors, hand-hewn ceiling beams, and walls lined with books. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, carved with symbols I didn't recognize but which felt familiar. It was the smaller room off the kitchen that changed everything. The second key opened this door, revealing what a note on the kitchen table called my grandmother's memory room. The walls were covered with photographs spanning what looked like a century, family trees written in fading ink, and shelves lined with mysterious objects that radiated age and importance. In the center stood an oak chest carved with symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light. Inside, I found treasures that spoke of a history I'd never known existed: clan tartans in colors that made my heart race, silver jewelry set with strange stones, books in Scottish Gaelic, and musical instruments I couldn't name. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather-bound journal with "For my granddaughter Maya" on the cover. As the Scottish evening gathered, I read by lamplight as my grandmother's words revealed a family history that no one had ever shared with me. We weren't just respectable Sinclairs from Edinburgh. We were descended from Highland clans that had inhabited these hills for centuries. My great-great-grandmother Kiva Mac Sinclair had been a bean tie, a keeper of clan customs who maintained the old ways even as the modern world pressed in around her. The journal told of the Highland clearances, when families like ours were driven from their ancestral lands. It told of a heritage hidden and almost lost, preserved by women who passed down songs, stories, and sacred objects from mother to daughter, even when the world demanded they forget who they were. "The gift skips generations sometimes," my grandmother had written. "Your father was too much of the modern world to hear the old songs, but I've watched you, Maya, and I see the flame still burns in you, even if you don't know it yet. You have the restlessness that comes from living apart from your true nature." I spent that night in the cottage, sleeping under quilts that smelled of lavender and wood smoke. I dreamed of hills that sang and stones that remembered, of women in flowing tartan who beckoned me to join their ancient dance. When I woke, I felt different, as if something that had been sleeping inside me for 38 years was finally stirring to life. When I called David to say I was staying another day, his irritation crackled through the poor phone connection. "This is ridiculous. You're getting sentimental about a pile of old stone. Come home and let's get it appraised for sale." But I couldn't leave. I spent days exploring the cottage, finding hidden compartments filled with herbal remedies, bundles of dried plants, carved stones that seemed to pulse with quiet energy. Each discovery felt like finding pieces of myself I'd never known were missing. On my third day, I was visited by Moira MacLeod, an elderly woman I'd met at my grandmother's funeral. She arrived carrying fresh scones and wearing a knowing smile. "So you're settling in," she said, looking around with familiarity. "Isla said you'd come eventually. She said you had the sight, that you could feel things others couldn't. Do you, lass?" I thought of childhood dreams of landscapes I'd never seen but somehow knew, of music that made my heart race though I'd never heard the melodies. I thought of the restlessness that had plagued my adult life, the sense I was living someone else's story. "I think so," I whispered, feeling a door open inside me. Moira became my first teacher. She'd been my grandmother's closest friend and another keeper of the old ways. Over tea, she explained the responsibilities that came with being a tradition keeper, about festivals and ceremonies that still marked the seasons for those who remembered how to see them. "Your grandmother was one of the last who learned everything from her mother and grandmother," Moira explained. "She was waiting for someone from the family to carry it forward. That someone is you." When I told David I needed to extend my stay, his patience finally snapped. "This is insane, Maya. You're having some kind of breakdown. Come home immediately or I'll drag you back myself." His tone, the assumption he could command my choices, the dismissal of feelings he didn't understand, crystallized every doubt I'd carried about our marriage. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice steady and cold. "This is important to me, David. I need you to respect that." "Respect what? Your obsession with Celtic nonsense? You're an accountant from Edinburgh, not some Highland mystic. Stop pretending to be something you're not." "Maybe I've been pretending to be something I'm not for the past 15 years, I replied. "Maybe it's time I stopped." The divorce papers arrived a week later. David wasted no time filing, citing abandonment and demanding I sell the cottage to split the proceeds. But Scottish inheritance law was on my side, the cottage had been left to me alone, and David had no legal claim to it. I hired Sarah McBride, a solicitor who specialized in Highland property law. She counterfiled on my behalf, and David's overreaching demands were dismissed. The divorce was finalized months later, with David keeping our Edinburgh assets while I kept my inheritance. During the legal proceedings, I remained at the cottage, learning from Moira and slowly understanding what I'd inherited. The cottage was more than a home, it was a repository of cultural knowledge preserved through generations. The carved symbols weren't decoration but a form of writing that recorded genealogies, medicinal recipes, and seasonal ceremonies. Under Moira's guidance, I learned the old language, began to understand songs and stories passed down through my family for centuries. I learned to read the landscape differently, to see sacred sites invisible to untrained eyes. Most importantly, I learned to trust intuitive knowledge I'd been taught to ignore. I discovered I was part of a network of tradition keepers who had quietly maintained Highland cultural traditions through centuries of suppression. We weren't museum pieces but living links in an unbroken chain of cultural transmission, hidden when necessary but never lost. The cottage came alive under my care. I repaired the roof, restored the garden using my grandmother's heritage seeds, and began receiving visitors, other tradition keepers who had known my grandmother and were curious about her granddaughter. My first real test came with the autumn equinox. Moira explained that the cottage had always hosted seasonal ceremonies, and the community hoped I would continue the tradition. When the evening came and a dozen tradition keepers gathered in my grandmother's garden under a brilliant moon, I felt my ancestors' presence guiding me. The words of the ceremony came as if I'd known them all my life. When we raised our voices in ancient songs of thanksgiving for the harvest, I felt a connection to the land and my ancestors deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. An elderly piper named Hamish MacCrimmon approached me afterward. "You have the gift, lass," he said simply. "Your grandmother saw it in you from when you were small. She knew you'd come back to us eventually." "But I don't know enough," I protested. "How can I be responsible for continuing something so important when I'm still learning?" Hamish smiled. "None of us knows enough, Maya. The tradition is bigger than any one person can hold. Your job isn't to know everything, it's to keep the flame burning so it can be passed on to whoever comes after you." Through the Highland winter, I deepened my studies. The cottage became my university and sanctuary, where I explored aspects of myself I'd never known existed. I learned to weave using my great-great-grandmother's loom, to prepare herbal remedies from Highland plants, to play traditional music on ancient instruments. I resigned from my Edinburgh job and began supporting myself through guided tours of Highland historical sites and workshops on traditional crafts. The work paid less than my corporate salary but fed something in me that numbers on ledgers never had. Fiona visited that summer, initially bewildered by my choices. "This is charming, Maya, but surely you're not staying permanently? What about your career, meeting someone new?" But by the end of her 3-day visit, something had shifted. After a sunrise walk to the ancient standing stones overlooking the glen, she said quietly, "I can see why you love it here. There's something about this place, it feels like it has stories to tell." I showed her the gentler traditions, the herb garden, clan tartans that told our family's story, songs passed down through generations. I taught her to weave a simple pattern, watching her face change as her fingers found the ancient rhythm. When she left, Fiona promised to visit regularly and learn more about the family history we'd inherited but never explored. "Maybe there's more to being a Sinclair than I thought," she said. The cottage became a center for Highland cultural preservation. Tradition keepers from across Scotland came to study my grandmother's materials, share knowledge, and participate in seasonal ceremonies. I began documenting everything I learned, creating archives for future generations. The work was challenging, reconstructing lost traditions from fragments, navigating controversies about proper interpretations, resisting pressure to abandon old ways for more practical pursuits. But there were moments of pure magic when ancient songs rose in perfect harmony, when traditional remedies healed where modern medicine had failed, when young people discovered connections to ancestors they'd never known existed. Standing in my grandmother's garden on a clear Highland evening, I felt profound peace and purpose. I was no longer Maya Sinclair the accountant, dutiful daughter, and disappointed wife. I was Maya Sinclair, tradition keeper, heir to centuries of Highland wisdom, guardian of stories that needed telling. The cottage had given me more than a home. It had given me a reason to exist beyond personal ambition or social expectations. I'd learned that true wealth isn't measured in bank balances but in the depth of our connections to the land, our ancestors, and the communities that shape us. The work required more than I had initially understood. Each tradition I learned carried layers of meaning that took months to fully comprehend. The Gaelic language, for instance, wasn't just about vocabulary and grammar, it was about understanding a completely different way of seeing the world. Where English might have one word for water, Gaelic had dozens, each describing not just the substance but its relationship to the land, the seasons, the spiritual world. Moira taught me that my great-great-grandmother Kiva had been particularly gifted in what the Highland tradition called second sight, the ability to perceive things beyond the ordinary senses. This wasn't supernatural nonsense, Moira explained, but rather a heightened sensitivity to patterns and connections that most people had learned to ignore. Your grandmother Isla had it too, Moira told me one winter evening as we sat by the cottage fire, working on traditional embroidery patterns that told stories through their designs. She could sense when someone in the community was in trouble, could predict weather changes days before they happened, could read people's characters just by watching how they moved through the landscape. I began to recognize similar abilities in myself. During my guided tours, I found I could sense which visitors were genuinely interested in learning and which were just collecting experiences to boast about later. I could tell when someone in our seasonal ceremonies was struggling with personal difficulties, even if they said nothing about it. Most remarkably, I began to understand the land itself, knowing instinctively which plants were ready for harvesting, which paths were safe to walk in different weather conditions, which stones held the most energy for ceremonial purposes. The cottage revealed new secrets as I lived there longer. Hidden behind loose stones in the cellar, I found additional caches of artifacts, silver brooches that had been worn by clan chiefs centuries ago, ceremonial cups carved from single pieces of wood, bundles of herbs that had been preserved with techniques I was only beginning to understand. Each discovery required careful research to understand its significance and proper use. One particularly significant find was a collection of clootie rags, strips of cloth that had been blessed in sacred wells and used for healing ceremonies. These weren't tourist curiosities but genuine ritual objects that had been blessed by generations of tradition keepers. Moira taught me the proper protocols for using them, the specific wells where they should be taken for renewal, the prayers that needed to be spoken to maintain their power. The seasonal ceremonies became increasingly complex as I learned more about their deeper meanings. The autumn equinox wasn't just about thanksgiving for the harvest, it was about acknowledging the balance between light and dark, life and death, growth and rest that governed all natural cycles. The participants came not just to observe but to align their own lives with these larger rhythms, to find their place within the great wheel of the year. I learned to prepare the traditional foods that accompanied each ceremony: bannocks baked with grains that had been grown in Highland soil for centuries, mead brewed according to recipes that predated written history, cheeses made from the milk of cattle that grazed on hills where their ancestors had grazed for thousands of years. Each food carried not just nutrition but cultural memory, connecting us to ancestors who had sustained themselves on the same flavors in the same landscape. The music was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the traditions to master. Highland music wasn't just about playing the right notes, it was about understanding the relationship between melody and landscape, the way certain tunes were connected to specific places and could only be properly played in their proper context. I spent months learning to play the clarsach, a traditional Highland harp whose strings seemed to vibrate with the voices of ancient bards. Hamish MacCrimmon became my most demanding teacher. He visited the cottage monthly, bringing his pipes and an encyclopedic knowledge of Highland musical traditions that stretched back to the earliest recorded clan histories. Under his guidance, I learned that many of the tunes I was studying weren't just entertainment. They were historical documents that preserved information about battles, migrations, alliances, and betrayals that had shaped Highland culture for centuries. Music is memory made audible, Hamish told me during one particularly intensive lesson. When you play these tunes properly, you're not just making sounds, you're calling forth the spirits of everyone who played them before you, everyone who danced to them, everyone who found comfort or inspiration in their melodies. The responsibility sometimes felt overwhelming. I was no longer just preserving objects and knowledge. I was maintaining a living connection between the present and the past, ensuring that the wisdom of my ancestors remained available to guide future generations. The weight of this responsibility would sometimes wake me in the middle of the night, leaving me staring at the cottage's ancient ceiling beams and wondering if I was truly worthy of what had been entrusted to me. But doubt was balanced by moments of profound connection and understanding. During the winter solstice ceremony of my second year at the cottage, something shifted in my relationship with the traditions I was learning. As we lit the ceremonial fire that would burn through the longest night, I felt the presence of my ancestors not as distant historical figures, but as living companions whose wisdom flowed through me like water through a well-worn channel. The ceremony that night included elements I had never experienced before. Participants bringing items that represented challenges they wanted to release, writing intentions for the coming year on pieces of birch bark that would be burned in the sacred fire, sharing stories that connected their personal struggles to the larger cycles of renewal and transformation that governed all life. As the fire burned down and dawn approached, an elderly woman named Ailey Morrison approached me. She was a tradition keeper from the Isle of Harris, someone whose reputation for wisdom extended throughout the Highland cultural community. She rarely spoke at gatherings, but when she did, everyone listened. "You've found your voice, lass," she said simply, her weathered hands warm against mine. "I knew your grandmother for 60 years, and tonight I heard her speaking through you. The tradition is safe in your hands." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not just because of the validation they offered, but because I realized she was right. I was no longer struggling to learn the traditions. I was living them, breathing them, becoming them in ways that felt as natural as the changing of the seasons. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Word of the cottage's role as a cultural center had spread throughout Scotland and beyond, bringing visitors from Highland communities around the world, descendants who had been separated from their heritage by emigration, scholars researching traditional practices, musicians seeking to learn authentic Highland techniques. I began offering residential workshops where people could spend several days immersed in traditional practices. These weren't tourist experiences but serious educational programs for people genuinely committed to learning and preserving Highland culture. Participants learned to prepare traditional foods, craft textiles using historical techniques, understand the astronomical knowledge that governed Highland agricultural and ceremonial calendars, and develop the sensitivity needed to work with the spiritual aspects of the traditions. One particularly memorable workshop participant was James Mackenzie, a man in his 70s whose great-grandfather had emigrated from the Highlands to Nova Scotia during the clearances. James had grown up hearing fragments of Gaelic songs and stories, but the connection had been gradually lost as his family assimilated into Canadian culture. "I felt like I was missing half of myself my entire life," he told me on the last night of his week-long stay. "I didn't understand what that emptiness was until I heard you singing the old songs in their proper context. It's like a part of my soul that went to sleep when I was a child has finally woken up." James returned to Nova Scotia with commitments to establish a Highland cultural group in his community and to begin teaching the songs and stories he'd learned at the cottage. He was one of many participants who became ambassadors for the traditions, carrying the knowledge they'd gained back to Highland communities around the world. The cottage itself continued to reveal its secrets. During restoration work in the third year, we discovered that the building was much older than anyone had realized. Beneath the 18th century additions were stone foundations that appeared to date back several centuries earlier. Archaeological investigation revealed that the site had been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years, with each generation building on the foundations left by their predecessors. This discovery helped explain why the cottage felt so deeply connected to the land and why it had been chosen as a repository for cultural knowledge. It wasn't just a house, it was a sacred site that had been recognized as a place of power by countless generations of Highland people. The memory room expanded as I acquired additional materials from tradition keepers who were aging and needed to ensure their collections would be properly preserved. Moira donated her grandmother's collection of healing songs, each one specific to particular ailments and requiring precise pronunciation to be effective. Hamish contributed manuscripts of pipe music that existed nowhere else, tunes that had been passed down through his family for generations without ever being written down until now. An unexpected donation came from Fiona, who had been quietly researching our family history in Edinburgh's archives. She arrived one autumn day with boxes of documents she'd discovered in the National Library, correspondence between our great-great-grandmother Kiva and other tradition keepers, legal documents relating to land disputes during the clearances, and a collection of photographs that showed our ancestors participating in ceremonies identical to those we were now maintaining. "I've been thinking about what you said about living someone else's story," Fiona told me as we examined the photographs together. "I realized I've been so focused on building my own career that I never thought about the stories that built me. These people are people, they face challenges that make my courtroom battles look trivial. They preserve something precious under circumstances we can barely imagine." Fiona couldn't leave her Edinburgh life to join me at the cottage, but she became an important ally in documenting and preserving the traditions. Her legal skills proved invaluable in establishing the cottage as a legally protected cultural site, ensuring that it could never be sold or developed regardless of what happened to future generations of our family. She also helped me navigate the complex regulations governing the display and preservation of historical artifacts, working with museums and universities to create partnerships that would increase awareness of Highland cultural traditions while keeping the most sacred objects under community control. The fourth year brought recognition from unexpected quarters. The Scottish Government invited me to serve on a committee developing policies for protecting intangible cultural heritage. Universities began sending graduate students to study the preservation methods we were using at the cottage. International organizations focused on Indigenous cultural preservation reached out to learn about our approaches to maintaining living traditions in a modern context. But the most meaningful recognition came from within the Highland tradition-keeping community itself. During the Beltane celebration of my fourth year, I was formally initiated as a Bean Fiza, a wise woman whose knowledge and judgment could be trusted to guide the community's spiritual and cultural life. The ceremony took place at dawn on the hill behind the cottage, with tradition keepers from across Scotland gathering to witness and participate. The initiation involved challenges that tested not just my knowledge of traditions, but my understanding of their deeper meanings and my ability to adapt them to contemporary circumstances. I was required to demonstrate skills ranging from identifying medicinal plants and preparing traditional remedies to leading complex ceremonial procedures and resolving disputes between community members. The final test was the most difficult. I was asked to spend 3 days and nights alone on the hill, fasting and meditating, seeking guidance from the ancestors about the future direction of the traditions I was helping to preserve. This wasn't a symbolic exercise, but a genuine spiritual practice that required me to put aside my ordinary consciousness and open myself to forms of knowledge that couldn't be accessed through normal rational thought. During those 3 days, I experienced visions and insights that were more vivid and meaningful than any dream I'd ever had. I saw the cottage as it had been in different historical periods, witnessed ceremonies conducted by ancestors whose names had been lost to history, understood connections between land and tradition that I'd never intellectually grasped before. On the morning of the fourth day, when the community gathered to hear what I'd learned during my vigil, I found myself speaking words that seemed to come from a source deeper than my ordinary mind. I described a vision of Highland culture not as a relic of the past, but as a living tradition that could offer guidance and healing to people struggling with the spiritual emptiness of modern life. "The old ways aren't museum pieces," I heard myself saying, my voice carrying an authority that surprised me. "They're tools for living wisely in any time and place. Our ancestors developed these practices over thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. They learned how to live in harmony with natural cycles, how to find meaning in suffering, how to maintain community bonds across generations. This knowledge isn't just our heritage, it's our gift to the future." The initiation ceremony concluded with the presentation of symbols representing my new status within the community. Moira placed around my neck a silver torque that had been worn by wise women for centuries, its weight a constant reminder of the responsibilities I was accepting. Hamish presented me with a ceremonial staff carved with symbols representing the elements and directions, tools for focusing energy during ritual work. But the most meaningful gift came from Ailey Morrison, who had traveled from Harris specifically for the ceremony. She gave me a small leather pouch containing stones gathered from sacred sites throughout the Highlands, memory stones that carried the accumulated wisdom of all the tradition keepers who had handled them over the centuries. "These will help you remember who you are when the world tries to convince you otherwise," she said as she pressed the pouch into my hands. "They've been carried by every wise woman in our lineage back to the beginning of memory. Now they're yours to carry forward." As I stood on the hill that morning, surrounded by people who had become more than teachers, they had become my true family, I felt the full weight and joy of what I had become. I was no longer Maya Sinclair, the lost accountant, or even Maya Sinclair, the tradition keeper. I was Maya Sinclair, Bean Fiza, wise woman, bridge between worlds, keeper of the flame that had burned continuously for thousands of years. The cottage below us looked small and humble from this height, but I knew it was much more than a building. It was a nexus where past and present intersected, where ancient wisdom remained available to contemporary seekers, where the healing power of tradition could be accessed by anyone willing to approach it with respect and genuine need. I touched the silver pendant at my throat, the one Moira had given me that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, now joined by the torque that marked my formal recognition as a wise woman. The weight of both pieces felt right, like armor that protected not through hardness but through connection to something larger and more enduring than any individual life. I whispered gratitude to the women who had preserved this heritage through centuries of change and challenge, promising to continue their work with the same courage and dedication they had shown. The wind carried the scent of heather and the distant sound of pipes from the valley below, and I smiled. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. For the first time in my life, I was completely, authentically myself. Standing on this highland hill with ancient songs humming in my blood and the weight of tradition around my shoulders, I knew I was finally, truly home. The cottage windows glowed golden in the morning light below, filled with warm light and the promise of stories yet to be told. Each day would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve the traditions I'd inherited, new chances to help others discover the heritage waiting within them like seeds waiting for spring. But in this moment I was simply grateful, grateful for the grandmother who had seen in me what I couldn't see in myself, grateful for the cottage that had become my sanctuary and calling, grateful for the long journey from Edinburgh's ordered streets to this wild glen where my heart had finally learned to sing in its own voice. I was Maya Sinclair, Bean Fiza, keeper of Highland traditions, guardian of ancestral wisdom, and inheritor of a legacy more valuable than gold. And I was home. The years that followed my initiation brought challenges I could never have anticipated. As word of the cottage's role as a cultural center spread beyond Scotland, I found myself at the center of debates about cultural appropriation, authenticity, and the commercialization of Indigenous traditions. Some academics questioned whether someone who had grown up disconnected from Highland culture could legitimately claim the role of tradition keeper. Others worried that opening the traditions to outsiders, even respectful ones, would inevitably lead to their dilution or misuse. These criticisms forced me to examine my motivations more carefully. Was I truly serving the traditions or reshaping them to fit my understanding? The answer came when Moira offered perspective during one of our evening conversations. "Tradition isn't a museum exhibit, lass," she said. "It's a living river that has to keep flowing or it dies. Every generation of tradition keepers has faced accusations of changing things, but the past wasn't pure, it was constantly adapting to new circumstances, just like the present." Her words helped me understand that authenticity meant maintaining the essential spirit of traditions while allowing natural evolution. Rather than defending myself with arguments, I invited critics to visit the cottage and see our work firsthand. Many arrived expecting commercialized performances but found serious scholarship and genuine community building. Dr. Kenneth MacLeod, a prominent Celtic studies professor and former critic, spent a week at the cottage during summer solstice celebrations. He left transformed, writing that he had witnessed the most authentic expression of living Highland tradition in 30 years of study. The validation from scholars attracted new partners committed to preserving Highland culture thoughtfully. The cottage became a hub for research projects and educational initiatives connecting Highland communities worldwide. One of the most significant developments was the establishment of the Highland Heritage Network, a formal organization that linked tradition keepers, cultural centers, universities, and community groups across Scotland, Ireland, Nova Scotia, and other regions with significant Highland populations. The network facilitated the sharing of knowledge and resources, provided support for endangered traditions, and created opportunities for young people to connect with their cultural heritage. I found myself traveling extensively, visiting Highland communities from the Outer Hebrides to North Carolina's mountains, learning how different groups maintain traditions under various circumstances. In Nova Scotia, I met Clearance descendants who had preserved Gaelic language and music for over 2 centuries. In Appalachian Mountains, Highland descendants had created hybrid traditions combining Scottish customs with Cherokee and African American influences. Each community faced similar challenges: young people leaving for urban opportunities, pressure to assimilate, economic difficulties. But each had developed unique strategies for overcoming these challenges, and our growing network allowed them to share solutions. The cottage evolved from a single cultural center to coordination hub for this expanding network. We developed training programs, created digital archives, and established funding mechanisms supporting community-based preservation projects. But perhaps the most personally meaningful development was the gradual recognition that I was no longer learning to be a tradition keeper. I had become one, with responsibilities and abilities that extended far beyond my original understanding of the role. This transformation became clear during what we called the crisis of the stolen artifacts. A private collector had somehow acquired several pieces of Highland ceremonial regalia that had been thought lost during the clearances. Rather than returning them to Scottish museums or Highland communities, he planned to auction them to the highest bidders, potentially scattering these irreplaceable cultural artifacts to private collections around the world where they would be lost to the communities they had originally served. The Highland Heritage Network mounted a campaign to prevent the sale and secure the artifacts returned to Scotland. I found myself leading the response, coordinating legal strategies, media campaigns, and fundraising efforts. The campaign took 2 years and involved dozens of organizations, but the breakthrough came when the collector contacted me directly. He had come to understand the artifact's cultural significance to living communities. Rather than proceeding with the auction, he wanted to discuss terms for returning the pieces to Scotland. The negotiations created new protocols for handling similar situations and demonstrated that tradition keepers needed modern advocacy skills alongside ancient knowledge. The cottage itself continued to evolve during this period. We added a proper archive building to house the growing collection of materials from Highland communities worldwide. We created guest accommodations that could house visiting scholars and tradition keepers for extended stays. We established partnerships with universities that brought graduate students to the cottage for intensive field study programs. Most importantly, we created what we called the Successor Program, a formal training initiative designed to identify and prepare the next generation of tradition keepers. The program was open to people of Highland descent from anywhere in the world, but it required serious commitment and extensive preparation. Participants spent months in preliminary study before arriving at the cottage for year-long residencies that combined intensive traditional education with practical training in the modern skills needed for cultural preservation work. The first group of Successor Program graduates included people from incredibly diverse backgrounds: a software engineer from Silicon Valley whose great-grandmother had emigrated from Skye, a sheep farmer from New Zealand whose family had maintained Gaelic songs through 5 generations of settlement, a university professor from Edinburgh who had grown up speaking Gaelic but had never learned the ceremonial traditions associated with the language. What united them wasn't just Highland ancestry but a shared commitment to carrying traditional knowledge forward in ways that honored both its ancient roots and contemporary relevance. Watching them work together during their residency year, I felt the same pride and satisfaction that I imagined my grandmother had felt when she recognized that I might be ready to carry on her work. The program's success attracted attention from other Indigenous communities facing similar challenges in preserving their cultural heritage. We began hosting exchange programs that brought tradition keepers from First Nations communities in Canada, Aboriginal communities in Australia, and Maori communities in New Zealand to share strategies and learn from one another's approaches. These exchanges revealed both the universal nature of the challenges facing Indigenous cultures and the unique solutions that different communities had developed. Native American traditions of council governance provided models for decision-making within Highland cultural organizations. Aboriginal Australian concepts of country and connection to place offered new perspectives on Highland relationships with the landscape. Maori strategies for language revitalization suggested approaches that could be adapted for Gaelic preservation. But perhaps the most profound exchange came when we hosted a group of Lakota tradition keepers from the American Great Plains. Their experiences preserving sacred practices under conditions of active government suppression provided sobering reminders of how fragile cultural transmission could be, while their success in maintaining spiritual traditions despite centuries of pressure offered inspiration for our own work. The Lakota visitors were particularly interested in our approaches to balancing cultural preservation with contemporary relevance, and several of them established ongoing relationships with Highland communities that continued long after their formal visit ended. These connections reminded me of the stories I had read about my great-great-grandmother Kiva, who had maintained correspondence with tradition keepers from other Celtic communities and had incorporated insights from their experiences into her own practice. As my role expanded beyond the cottage to encompass this growing network of cultural preservation work, I sometimes worried that I was moving too far from the quiet, contemplative life that had originally drawn me to Highland traditions. The constant travel, meetings, and administrative responsibilities left little time for the personal practices, meditation, ritual, music, and crafts that had nourished my soul during my early years in Glenmorvan. But Moira, now approaching 90 but still traveling regularly to visit tradition-keeping communities throughout Scotland, offered a different perspective during one of our conversations. "You're not abandoning the personal practices, lass," she said, watching me pack for yet another trip to a Highland Heritage Network conference. "You're extending them into the world where they're needed. Every meeting you attend, every alliance you build, every young person you train, that's all part of the great work of keeping the traditions alive. Your grandmother didn't spend all her time in meditation either. She was constantly writing letters, hosting visitors, traveling to communities that needed her knowledge. That's what tradition keepers do. We serve the tradition by serving the community." Her words helped me understand that my work hadn't taken me away from the path of tradition keeping, it had led me deeper into it. The cottage remained my home and my center, but it was no longer the limit of my responsibilities. I had become part of a vast, invisible network of people working to maintain cultural wisdom in a world that often seemed determined to forget everything that couldn't be monetized or digitized. This understanding deepened during my 10th year at the cottage, when I received word that Moira was dying. She had been diagnosed with cancer the previous winter, and despite treatment, her condition had gradually worsened. She spent her final months at the cottage, surrounded by the traditions and people she had devoted her life to serving. Caring for Moira during those last months was both heartbreaking and profoundly educational. She used her remaining time to pass on knowledge that had never been written down, stories that existed only in her memory, and insights about tradition keeping that could only be gained through decades of experience. "The work is bigger than any of us," she told me during one of our last conversations, her voice weak but her mind still sharp. "Sometimes you'll feel like you're carrying the whole weight of the past on your shoulders, but remember that you're not alone. Every tradition keeper who came before you faced the same fears, the same doubts, the same overwhelming sense of responsibility. And every one of them found ways to keep going, to keep the flame burning for whoever came next." She died peacefully in my grandmother's bed, surrounded by the artifacts and memories that had shaped both their lives. Her funeral brought together the largest gathering of Highland tradition keepers in living memory, with people traveling from across the world to honor someone who had touched their lives and their communities in countless ways. Standing at her graveside in the small cemetery overlooking Loch Tummel, I felt the full weight of inheritance, not just the knowledge and responsibility she had passed on to me, but the deeper obligation to ensure that her life's work would continue beyond my own limited time as a guardian of Highland traditions. That obligation guided the final major initiative of my time at the cottage, the creation of what we called the Highland Heritage Endowment, a financial foundation designed to ensure the long-term sustainability of cultural preservation work regardless of economic or political changes that might affect future funding. The endowment combined traditional fundraising with innovative approaches like cultural tourism, artisan cooperatives, and digital media projects that generated revenue while serving the broader mission of cultural preservation. Establishing the endowment required me to master skills that would have seemed impossible during my early days in Glenmorvan: investment strategies, legal frameworks, international tax law, and nonprofit management. But it also required the deeper wisdom that Moira and my other teachers had tried to instill in me, the ability to see beyond immediate challenges to long-term consequences, to balance competing interests and needs, to make decisions based on values rather than convenience. The endowment's creation marked what I recognized as the completion of my own transformation from student to teacher, from tradition keeper to tradition builder. I had not only learned to preserve what had been passed down to me, I had created new structures and institutions that would allow the preservation work to continue and grow beyond anything my predecessors could have imagined. As I write this, 15 years after first turning that iron key in the cottage door, I can see the full arc of the journey that brought me from Edinburgh accountant to Highland wise woman. The cottage remains my home and my center, but it is now also the heart of a global network that connects Highland communities and supports cultural preservation work on every continent where Highland descendants have settled. The traditions themselves have evolved during my time as their guardian, adapting to new technologies and contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential character and purpose. Young people learn Gaelic through online programs but practice it during gatherings at sacred sites. Traditional crafts are preserved through video documentation, but continue to be transmitted through hands-on teaching. Ancient songs are recorded in professional studios but remain most powerful when sung around cottage fires under starlit skies. I am no longer the uncertain woman who inherited a cottage she didn't understand. I am a keeper of living traditions, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of wisdom that has survived countless challenges and will continue long after my own guardianship ends. The cottage has given me more than a home or even a calling. It has given me a place in the great chain of transmission that connects the ancient past to the unknowable future. Standing in my grandmother's garden on this Highland evening, I touch the silver torque at my throat and whisper gratitude to all who came before and all who will come after. The work continues, the traditions endure, and the cottage keeps its ancient vigil in this hidden glen where time moves differently and wisdom waits patiently for those ready to receive it. I am Maya Sinclair, Bean Fiza, keeper of Highland traditions, guardian of ancestral wisdom, and inheritor of a legacy that grows richer with each passing year. And I am home.